Hi everyone, sorry I haven't recorded a video in a while. So last week I was looking into Mocha testing. Mocha testing is really useful. It allows you just to test your application and make sure that you're getting the results that you want from it. And testing is really important when you're building applications. But it was something that I hadn't done before, so I found a really useful tutorial online on a website called Semaphore that showed me how to build an API that let me use Mocha testing in conjunction with Node in JavaScript. So the API that this tutorial showed me how to build was to convert a RGB color code into a hex color code and vice versa. And I thought that it was a really good idea, so I decided to take the API that I built from this tutorial and make it into a full app. So I've built a whole interface for this app and a client side. And this is the finished website that I've built. I called it Colorvert just because, you know, you're converting your colors. So, and I can convert RGB to hex and hex to RGB. Just to quickly show you how it works, if you just type some random numbers into here for the RGB color values and colorvert it, a square comes up and gives you a preview of the color, and it shows you the hex code at the top and also changes the hex value and the form on the other side of the page to the same code as well. Or I can, you know, put a random hex code in here as well, convert it back to RGB. Again, it changes the color and it gives me the new RGB color values. So I just wanted to give you a quick walkthrough of how this application works. Okay, so I have my HTML file. I have, you know, all my classes that I need for my CSS and my IDs that I need in the different HTML tags that I need to grab those things in JavaScript. So I'm grabbing my buttons basically. So get element by ID, and I have these RGB to hex and hex to RGB buttons, and I'm adding event listeners to them. So I'm listening for a click on the button, and when that happens, I'm calling different functions to help to convert the values that have been put into the form. So that's just these buttons here. I'm just listening for a click on these buttons, and when that happens, it calls the function on the JavaScript file. So for RGB to hex, I'm listening for a click. I call this RGB to hex function. So what that does first of all is it grabs the RGB values from the form. So from each of the form fields here, RGB, it grabs each of these values out of the text boxes and it stores them into variables. And I just run a quick validation on it to make sure that none of these fields are empty. So if it's an empty string, then I'll show an alert saying please give, you know, 3 values for the RGB code. And I want to make sure that the value for each one is not over 255, which is the maximum number for a color code, for an RGB color code. And also make sure that the length of the integer that you're getting is not longer than 3 digits long. So if it passes those validations, then what I want to do is grab that the square here. I just grab that using document.getElementById, and I just use JavaScript to change the background color of that div to equal the same values that have been put into the form by the user. And from there, I call this colorvert RGB function, and I pass each of these red, green, and blue values into this function. So what this function does is it makes the HTTP request to the API and it passes in the values that need to be converted. So I'm using this fetch API. Fetch is really useful. It's an inbuilt API that you can use with JavaScript, and all you have to do is pass it a URL and it can make the HTTP request for you. So first of all, I had to construct the URL to give to fetch so that it can make the HTTP request. So I have on my server, I've set up different routes that I can use to call RGB to hex or hex to RGB, and then I just need to pass into the string the queries for the different values, so for red, green, and blue. So I have to pass these variables into this URL just to construct the URL to pass to fetch to hit that API on the back end. So I pass fetch the URL. From here, it goes to the server and it hits this /RGB to hex route. And then I'm taking the request, the HTTP request, the query from the URL, and then pulling out the red, green, and blue values, which we set here, red equals, green equals, blue equals. And I'm storing those into variables, and I'm running a parse int with base 10 just so that it'll pull out the actual number, the integer from the string, because we had to convert it to a string to make the URL in the first place. So red, green, and blue then gives the integers for those same values. And then I'm passing those values into this other RGB to hex function that comes from this converter file. So if you see up here, var converter is just equal to requiring this converter.js file up here. That's just another file that I have here that I'll show you in a second. So I'm calling this function from that file and passing in the red, green, and blue values. So to convert those values to hex, all we've done is take red, green, and blue and then convert it to a string and pass in base 16. So that converts the number that we have from the form into a hexadecimal representation of the same number. So that'll be any kind of number between 0 to 9 or any letter between A and F. It could be anything. So we have these red hex, green hex, blue hex converted values in base 16. We just want to run this pad function on them first to make sure that the length is right, because hex values are always 2 digits long. So if you have, say, a 1-digit number like 8, you want to make sure that it becomes 08 so that you get a hex value for that color that is 2 digits long. So if the hex length is equal to 1, then we'll just pad the string at the front with a 0. And then we're calling the hex conversion with the red, green, and blue hex codes, and then returning that to the function on the server side from the route. So it calls this converter function again. It stores the result of that into this hex variable, and then it passes that back in the HTTP response. So if we go back to the client side, it gets the HTTP response back from the fetch request. So we're using a promise here, .then. So we're saying once fetch has made that URL call and it's returned something, then we're passing it a callback to run with the response that fetch has returned us, that the HTTP response. And the response returns inside an object. So in order for us to pull out the hex code that we want from that object, we have to do response.text, and then we make another promise. So once we've got the text from that response, then we pass that text into another callback. And all we're doing here is just getting 2 of the HTML elements that we want to change to reflect the value of the converted code on the page. So we have just again get element by ID, and we're changing both the form field on the opposite side of the page, so this hex field here, and also this div up here, both to show if that was for an RGB to hex, they'll both show the result of the conversion from RGB to hex. And it's much the same, obviously, for the conversion from hex back to RGB again. We listen for a click on the button. Once we hear that click, we call this function to grab the hex code from the form. But first, we just want to run a regex on the hex code just to make sure that it's a valid hex code. So make sure that it's 6 digits long, that it has numbers only between 0 and 9, and letters between A and F. Again, some quick validations. We want to make sure that valid hex check passes, and also to make sure that the form field isn't empty and that the length is not longer than or less than 6 digits or letters long. So once it passes the validations, we again change the background color of that square div to show a preview of the color. And then I pass that hex variable with the hex color code into the colorvert function. So again, it's pretty much the same as the RGB function, but the opposite way around. So I have to make the URL first. it's a lot simpler for hex, obviously, because it's just one value as opposed to 3. So just plug that onto the end of the URL and then put that URL into the fetch API. Again, fetch hits this /hex to RGB route on the back end. It pulls the hex code out from the URL query and stores it in a variable, and then it passes that hex variable into the hex to RGB function that comes from the converter file. So to convert hex back to RGB, what we do is we use parseInt. So what this does is it takes different substrings from the hex code string that we have. So it takes the first 2 digits for red, the second 2 digits for green, and the third 2 digits for set of digits for blue. And parseInt converts that string back into integers using this reference of base 16. So it knows that it's getting a string that is in base 16 and it can convert it back to a base 10 integer to give us our 0 to 255 values for red, green, and blue. And then it returns an array of the red, green, and blue values. So we stored the result of that RGB or hex to RGB conversion in this RGB function variable. RGB, again, if you remember, it returns an array of RGB values. Because it's an array, it has to be in a string to be able to be sent back in the HTTP response. So we have to use JSON.stringify on this array variable to turn it into a string of an array. So that response is sent back in the HTTP response. It comes back to the front end. So it pulls, again, that text out of the object that returns from the fetch request. And then we want to parse that JSON object because we JSON stringified it to turn it into a string. So we want to parse it to turn it from a string back into the array that it originally was. So we pass the text into JSON parse and store that in the RGB array variable. And then it's as simple as just pulling out the different indices from the array to equal red, green, and blue. So index 0, 1, and 2 for red, green, and blue values. And then again, changing the HTML values on the form on this side of the page and the div up at the top of the page to reflect the converted RGB values from hex. So I just wanted to walk you through how this conversion works, how we're making the HTTP calls from the front end to the back end, and then in my next video I'm going to talk about how the Mocha testing works and how you can use testing to make sure that your code works exactly the way that you're expecting it to. So I'll put a link to the tutorial that I used on the bottom of this video and also the GitHub repo as well. So thank you for watching. Bye.